loads of presentations on this subject in the last few months, and most of the ones that I've seen have described the earthquake and tsunami in some detail that most people are aware of what happened now. I'll give a quick couple of slides dealing with the relevance of this event to New Zealand, for those who don't know the setting of New Zealand and its tsunami hazard, and for the benefit of anyone who doesn't know the Pacific Northwest. And I've given this presentation to people outside of the US, so slide on the Pacific Northwest as well. An introduction to some of the locations that we visited in Japan, just so everybody's got a picture in their minds of the environment they're looking at and how that can be related back to the US coast. Then I'll spend probably 15 minutes looking at vertical evacuation, showing some examples of the structures and the levels of damage that occurred at the structures and the number of people that were saved. Then I'll talk about some of the softer sides of the evacuation strategy around access and gaining owner agreement to use buildings as facilities. And then for the final 15 minutes, I'll talk about natural and informal warnings, official tsunami warnings, and the movement of people during the evacuation and after, once they've got to evacuation refuge. Then summarise and bring it back to Washington and New Zealand. So on the left-hand side, there's a list of issues that we're already aware of for tsunami warnings and evacuation. And there's really nothing brand new in this presentation. It's really presenting insights into what worked and what didn't in Japan. And everything that comes up are issues that we've discussed previously, that people who are looking at tsunami evacuation are well aware of. There are some potential approaches to the issues that we've recognised already, and the slides include some of the experiences of emergency officials and their concerns for the future, their changing attitudes and priorities. I should say that the interviews that we did with emergency officials were carried out over 7 days, 9 days in 7 locations. So it's relatively high level, but 6 months after the event, the huge amount of data that's come from local researchers on the ground has fed up to the emergency officials. So talking to them has provided us with a view of the overall experience in their locations. So as I said, a couple of slides on the earthquake and tsunami, and I'll just concentrate on people's perceptions of the earthquake along the coast. So the ground shaking was several minutes long. The officials we spoke to reported 2 to 3 minutes consistently. And the JMA shaking intensity was 5 lower to 6 upper along the coastal areas. And on the right-hand side, there's the table that describes human perception at these levels. And this is equivalent to MMI 7 to 10. So most of the damage in the coastal areas to buildings and timber structures particularly was limited to damage to old roof tiles or falling facades. And there was many landslides and a lot of liquefaction damage. And although the tsunami washed away a lot of the evidence of liquefaction, there's a few photos from Matori City in the Sendai Plains which show significant liquefaction in the roads and cars that have fallen into holes in the road that have appeared. Another significant impact was the seismic subsidence, which reached about 0.8 metres closest to the coast, closest to the epicenter. And that's had an impact on the effectiveness of defences having dropped on land prior to the tsunami. So these are some of the perceptions that we interviewed. As I said, 3 minutes of shaking was consistent between them. Cycles of mixed shaking was also consistently felt, and people recognised that it was longer or stronger than previous earthquakes,
which included the Miyagi offshore event. That's the 37-year recurrent local event. So people recognised that it could be this event, and another official recognised that this would be larger than the expected event, and there was a large tsunami on the way. In this tsunami, arrival time was minimum of around 20-25 minutes, and it varied along the coast. So as we moved south, and the southern end of our survey, tsunami arrival was closer to an hour. So people had a lot more time to respond in the Sendai Plains than they did in Kofanato, where the tide gauges registered 25 minutes arrival. There's a huge event affecting 600 kilometres of the coastline, inundating a huge area with inundation heights generally up to 30 metres. There were a few locations where inundation heights, the height of the water relative to mean sea level, were above 30 metres, but generally in the area that we were looking at, heights reached up to 20 and 30 metres. And a huge number of buildings damaged and life loss, standing in November at just under 20,000. So the coastline of that map may not appear too well on the screen in the room here. I think it's okay on the computer. But this gives a very quick overview of the setting of New Zealand and why this event is so important for us to learn from. We've got a very short recorded history of tsunami in New Zealand, with European settlement only occurring in 1840, so very short record. There's a paleo tsunami record that suggests large events further back in time. But since 1840, there's been a handful of significant events around the North Island. So Wellington got hit significantly. There's a 10-metre run-up in Gisborne from a local event. But the Hikurangi Trough is the key subduction zone that's likely to cause the most destruction in New Zealand. And there's a few segments that have been researched previously. In 2008, there was modelling done on some sections, some sources on the lower North Island, off Hawke's Bay, which is my field site for my research, and off the Rokumara Peninsula. And these are all local events causing wave arrival of 20-30 minutes, with local wave heights of over 5 metres at the shoreline. So increased run-up after that. The potential for the highest wave heights comes from the whole margin rupture, that after Japan has become very high priority for further research. And this event could cause greater than 5 metres wave heights at the whole shoreline of the east coast of the North Island. So the event in Japan has huge relevance for us in respect to this event. We have no idea of the recurrence interval of this event, so we're really working on very little data. And of course, that comes back to Cascadia with similar arrival times, 20 to 30 metres, and Venturato in 2007 modelled wave heights or flow depths of 5 to 8 metres at ocean shores in Long Beach. So very similar flow depths that we saw in the Sendai Plains. And the fact that there's two troughs arriving at 45 to 60 minutes has big similarities to what we saw in the Shinamaki City, where people returned to low-lying areas an hour after the event when was needed. And I'll return to that point later on. So it raises some questions about people's response in terms of waiting for official warnings. The fieldwork we carried out in Japan, I visited in May, June with a UK-based team looking at structural damage, geotechnical damage, impact on coastal defences, and we did a little work around the recovery and people's evacuation as well. Just more recently in October, I visited Japan with my PhD advisor looking specifically at people's response in the evacuation, when they evacuated, how people evacuated. And as I said before, we carried out interviews with emergency officials. We were working with local researchers from Yamaguchi University who looked specifically at sustainable transport planning and the use of bicycles events such as Signage as an evacuation means, and NPO Semi, who are an environmental planning non-profit organisation, and they're heavily involved now in the recovery of certain locations along the coast. On both trips, the field area we looked at was limited to between 38 and 40 degrees. As you can see from the right-hand chart, it's the area where the highest run-ups and inundation were occurring. And just to show this on the map, relative to the epicentre, I've marked the 7 locations that we visited in October and given some data around the tsunami heights that were recorded by local researchers there, indications of the population living in the inundated area, and the fatality rate compared to the population in the inundated area. So the survey locations include locations on the plains in the south and locations in the Rios coastline, which is the Drowned River Valley coastline, towards the north. And the varying topography comes out in the next few slides when I show these locations. But this has a huge impact on, firstly, the concentration of population living in low-lying areas, but also the time that it would take for people to evacuate to land higher than 20 metres. And I'll go through these locations in turn. This is Taro. I'm afraid the table that I've included there has moved across slightly. So the hazard map that's shown on the right-hand side indicates the inundation zone from the 1896 Meiji and the 1933 Showa tsunami. The inundation this time was very similar to this, as the flow of water is constrained by the steep topography around the town. Nevertheless, the red triangles and red circles that you see around the inundation area, some of those did become inundated in this event. The photographs are taken from the meeting of 3 sections of tsunami wall, which are 10 metres high, and they're indicated on the map with the red, black and yellow thick lines. And the top left photo shows is looking towards the north along the red section. So that's the area of town, the previously heavily populated area, or the high building density behind these defences. So you can see the tsunami overtopped these walls, and immediately after the event, there was a lot of debris swirling in this area as the water was trapped behind the defences. Despite the high defences, there was a fatality rate of 5%, based on a population in the area of 70 to 90%, and this is an estimate of mine. Kamaishi, another town in the Rios Plains, at the harbour point, at the harbour front, the valley is 1 kilometre from highland at one side to highland at the other, so the maximum distance people have to travel is only 500 metres, and based on the FEMA walking guidelines of 2,700 feet in 15 minutes, I think. That's very similar to the Japan walking guidelines for evacuation. People have enough time to get to highland in this location within 10 minutes. So this is a steel production area, and these photos are taken from close to the harbour point. And the red dots should show locations of the vertical evacuation buildings in this town. So they've moved when we've put the slides on this computer. So despite having vertical evacuation buildings and the close location of highland, we've got a fatality rate of 8% here. And again, that's people living within the inundation zone, low-lying areas. So moving on to Monferrato, these photographs are all taken in the location of that red dot. And you can see on the right-hand side the impact of the topography. In the distance, there's a school on the hill and a lot of residential buildings on increasing land with increasing height. In the foreground, the low-lying areas with tsunami damage. Again, the dimensions of this valley are about 1 kilometre across the harbour front. So again, people have 500 metres to go either side of the river to high land. And in this case, fatality rate was only 2%. So in contrast to very similar topography in Kamaishi. Tsunami is very similar, but the downtown area on the right-hand side is very low-lying, and I've shown the four vertical evacuation buildings in this area that I'll come on to in a few slides. Despite this low-lying area, the fatality rate was only 3%, so a lot lower than Aichi, where the highland was closer. Tsunami Sanriku, just a slide to show in the green bordered photograph the building density prior to the tsunami. This is typical for all of the locations, very densely populated areas. And this photo is taken from halfway a road to an elementary school, which is used as an evacuation facility. And the red bordered area shows 3 vertical evacuation buildings. I'll come on to show these buildings in more detail in the next few slides. The next 2 locations are located in the plains, and this town, this city, Shinomaki City, has 10 kilometres of coastline that's protected with 2-metre sea walls, so not the type of defences that we see in Taro on the first location. And you can see from the bottom left and the top left photos the flat land that surrounds this, that characterises this city. Tsunami flowed quite a way inland at the Kitakama River. I've just included a slide on the top right that shows just the amount of debris that's come from this surrounding neighbourhood. And there's, I think, half a dozen debris piles the size of. These are 15 metres high, and these all the way down the coast at the moment. So huge amount of debris being moved. And moving on to Uriagi in Natori City, very little high land here. The fatality rate of 8% is relative to living in the inundated area of Natori City. These are in Uriagi. Uriagi is located at the mouth of the river, has had very little experience with tsunami previously compared to the locations further up the coast. The bottom left slide shows the nature of the land here. It's extremely flat, and in the background of that slide there's a stand of trees which occurs on the coastline, a kilometre or so up the coast, so you can really large distances across this plain. So we'll return to Uriagi to look at some of the congestion issues that occurred there. So seeing the media photos immediately after the event and presentations since, I'm sure everyone's related that back to locations that they know. And for me, I don't know the Washington coastline in too much detail, but having visited Ocean Shores when I went to Natori City, it really reminded me of the topography there. So I've just put a few slides up comparing here Uriagi with Ocean Shores, and the striking resemblance that I saw between places further up the northern part of the coastline in the drowned river valleys. This example on the right is Tsunami, and here Aberdeen on the Washington coast. So moving on to vertical evacuation. When I'm talking about vertical evacuation, I'm talking about towers or structures or berms within the inundated area where people can evacuate upwards above the flow depth that occurs, rather than locations that are located outside of the inundation zone on high land, such as schools or other evacuation locations. So there's several projects running at the moment. You'll be aware of the Project Safe Haven project. GIA has international projects in Indonesia to design raised parks. And previously in Banda Aceh, shown on the bottom two photographs here, there's evacuation buildings that have been built into tsunami research centres following the 2004 event. The top right shows one of the prototype raised parks from GHI. There's also discussions at the moment about using pedestrian walkways above roads in Japan and in Banda Aceh, Padang in Indonesia as well. So in Japan, the government developed Designation Guidelines for vertical evacuation structures back in 2005, and their requirements were that the building would be reinforced concrete or steel reinforced concrete construction, constructed after their latest significant seismic standard released in 1981. And the height of the building would be according to the inundation depth expected. For a height of 2 meters depth at a location, the required stories would be three stories or higher. And I'll come on to talk about the community engagement in vertical evacuation projects, which returns to this point. The damage that we saw to the evacuation buildings on the first and second, or mainly the first trip was extensive scour, a lot of debris impact, and apart from that, it was damage to cladding of the building and glazing and contents. I haven't observed any earthquake damage significant enough that prevented people evacuating into a vertical evacuation building ahead of the tsunami, although some were overtopped at low tide, and I'll show some photos of those. The overturning failure of reinforced concrete buildings in Onagawa, where the flow depth was 17, 18 metres, doesn't really affect the buildings that I observed being designated structures, mainly because of their footprint size. The buildings that were overtopped were very small footprint size, and the designated buildings tend to be large footprint schools, hospitals, as the next few slides will show. So as I say, I'm not aware of designated buildings that that were significantly damaged, preventing people's life safety, but that may have happened, and I'd love to hear if anybody does know of locations. So here are 3 examples of schools in Tohoku. So the top 2 slides are located in Yuriagi, and we know that the high school on the top right saved 800 people, and they were in the school until the following day, when they had to walk out of the school through half a kilometre of tsunami water to get to a bus to be evacuated to another location. On the bottom 2 slides show the front and back of Arahama Elementary School, which is located around 750 metres inland and suffered relatively little damage, and 300 people survived here. There's also commonly used in Tohoku office blocks. On the right-hand side, 2 office blocks in Kessenuma Prefectural Office and a national office which saved over 300 people. And these buildings are located adjacent to each other. They're just 2 of about a dozen evacuation buildings in Kessenuma that have been officially designated. Apartment blocks were often seen as well. On the left-hand side, a community housing apartment block located right on the harbour front in Minami Sanriku was almost overtaken, but 44 people survived
on the roof. And this was chosen as an evacuation building in proximity to a sports ground and athletics field, which is right next door. And it was suggested as an evacuation building because of the high population of people expected events at that location. So, there was some concern around the location of this building when it was designated. But after discussions, people considered that 5 stories would be safe enough in any event. On the right-hand side,
your phone.
So in Tsunami Sanriku, 250 people survived in the hospital, which is only a few hundred metres further inland than the community housing block that was shown on this slide. Again, inundation almost to the roof, but many patients and doctors survived there, and about 100 residents who came from the immediate surrounding area, and another 80 people in a nursing home, care home building in Cascadia, this one. So another set of buildings that were used in Tohoku were hotels and retail buildings. On the right hand side, this one's in Ishinomaki, and it was in an area where the expected hazard was very low and wasn't expected to reach this building. 2 single-story retail buildings with car parks on top that were designated as evacuation structures and used successfully in this event. The hotel on the bottom left shows one of the consistent signage for vertical evacuation that was designated in 2005 as well. And I'll return to that later. So a couple of slides showing some of the damage that we saw. On the apartment block in Minami Sanriku, there's a significant amount of scour. And we weren't able to get anywhere near this building to actually measure the scour, but it looks to be at least 3 meters, 4 meters, and maybe deeper under the water. And the foundations of the building are exposed in this photo. The building survived to be used. And scour around the prefectural office in Cascadia. And the scour actually occurs around the perimeter wall and underneath the corner of the building there as well. The debris impact was commonly seen and destroyed quite a number of steel buildings. But on the left-hand photo showing the hospital in Minami Sanriku, you can see a frame of a steel building that's been washed into the front of the building and knocked out some of the columns, but the building survived intact to be used for the evacuation. And on the right-hand side, this is a picture looking into a ground floor corridor at the Arahama Elementary School. It shows some trees from the coastal forest that have been washed inland, and there's a couple of vehicles that have been washed into the building as well and lodged in the corridor. But aside from that, the building survived for people. As a comparison, just some photos of some steel frame buildings. Again, on the left-hand side, an impact of a car, which has damaged the non-structural steel columns, but not damaged the structural columns. So this building survived. But the level of damage that occurred to the steel buildings, it suggests that the buildings can be used for the evacuation. But prefer to be using reinforced concrete buildings if at all possible. And the photo on the right-hand side, people staying in this hotel, having had the damage cleaned up, so the structure's sound for people to stay in there now. In Cascadia, there was significant fire damage from spilt oil from oil tanks at the refinery. And this is Kadawaki Elementary School in Ishinomaki, and it's located right in front of an area of higher land. So the
people who had evacuated to this building were able to exit the building from the back and go to higher land prior to the building being affected by fire. It's just a good example of the level of damage that could occur to these buildings. And in Tsunami, the emergency official said to us that it was just pure luck that none of the buildings that had been used as evacuation were affected by fire. And he's now concerned about evacuation buildings being fire-proofed and wants to see government action to prevent oil spill in the event of a tsunami, to try to prevent the fires at the source. So some of the more softer or social issues around vertical evacuation. Obviously, in this event occurring in the mid-afternoon, all hours access wasn't required. A lot of the buildings were in use during office hours. So we spoke to emergency officials about whether these buildings would be accessible in the event of a tsunami at night. A lot of buildings in Japan are built with external stairs for the earthquake and fire evacuation, but there are a lot of buildings that don't have the external stairs that give access to the roof or fourth story. So the non-structural alternatives that are provided in the 2005 guidelines, and we saw a few examples of each of these. All our staffing in terms of hospitals or where buildings have security guards, the buildings use the security guards to open up the building for evacuees, or people can just walk through the doors as they're open. In the apartment blocks, residents are thought to be able to provide the access in an event for people to evacuate to the upper stories. But for some schools, the schools have agreed to allow people needing to evacuate to break into the building and use whatever means they can to get to the upper stories in the event of an emergency. In Kamaishi, a government building that's not staffed and doesn't have a security guard overnight, has come to an agreement with the local residents to provide 2 representatives with keys to the building. So the local residents in a couple of blocks around that building can access the building via those key holders in the event of a tsunami outside of office hours. And in other facilities, the facility manager or a caretaker of the building that's required to go to the building in the event of a tsunami. Now that comes with several problems around people getting to the building or being able to get to the building in the event of a tsunami, or welcoming this responsibility. And there's a location in Ofanato where the staff of the building actually exited the building. We're not sure whether people could get into or were locked out of the building as a result of that. And that was a private company building that was designated for evacuation. This suggests a few approaches, but it remains to be seen whether approaches such as allowing people to break in or giving local representatives keys to government buildings would function in the US or New Zealand. It's very culturally sensitive approaches, I think, and needs to be looked at on a case-by-case issue.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Stuart. If folks could go ahead and just remember to mute their phones. We've had a couple messages of people who are having, a difficult time hearing because of some feedback. So if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and just mute your phone so everybody can hear. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to some signage. The photographs on the right-hand side are examples of the consistent signage that's used in Japan, and these came about as part of the 2005 guidelines as well. The blue signs are examples of what's been agreed by the Ministry of Civil Defence and Emergency Management in New Zealand, but these haven't been used as yet for any designated buildings. One of the themes that came out when I was looking at the buildings in Japan was that many of the buildings, probably 90% of the buildings, don't have this consistent signage on, and it looks to be the buildings that were constructed since the guidelines that have had these stickers placed on them. It doesn't seem to have had an impact on local people's knowledge of the buildings and people being able to identify the buildings to get to, but it may have more of an influence around the tourist population. And certainly in some of these places there's a high tourist population, but this event occurred at the height of the tourist season, so we didn't really see an impact of this. There's certainly a consideration for identification of these buildings in New Zealand. So the owner agreement and community engagement. Obviously the owner agreement is key for designation of any building as a vertical evacuation facility. There's different issues around whether it's a government building or private buildings. In Japan, the majority of the buildings were community owned, and schools are commonly used for evacuation from any hazard, from flooding or landslide, or school grounds are used as muster points for earthquake evacuation. So the translation for using schools as vertical evacuation and having the schools open up their facilities for this is less of a step than having private companies agreeing that their buildings should be used for people to evacuate into. But the overriding theme that came from Japan was this one of social responsibility. So the Takano Kaikan building was a wedding venue where the owners considered that it was their corporate social responsibility and welcomed the building being opened up. And the cannery in Tsunami and the fisheries cooperative in Minami Sanriku considered that it was their responsibility to their workers to provide this vertical evacuation facility. So although there was some reticence around opening their buildings due to access issues and liability, once the community was engaged and discussed with the building owners recognised that the benefits of opening up their buildings. The community were also involved in Kamaishi and Ofanato in suggesting buildings to the local government and approaching building owners to ask if they would consider their building to be used as such a facility. And that happened at the Fisheries Cooperative, which eventually became a designated building. In Kamaishi, a lot of the buildings that were suggested by the community didn't meet the government guidelines due to 1981 construction age. Some of these buildings were used in the event as unofficial locations to evacuate to, and people did survive in them. But the local government was unable to officially designate those. So it seems that community engagement of the type that's being used now in Project Safe Haven and that we use in New Zealand can be used to streamline this discussion with building owners and stress the importance of these facilities to the local community. Another issue that was really shown all down the coast in Japan is the requirement for these facilities to house people for at least 24 hours and 48 hours in many cases. Provisions were not provided in these facilities in Japan. There were facilities that had provisions from the day-to-day use, so large supermarkets or community centres may have had food in them already, or apartment buildings in people's flats. But the official in Yuriagi reported that the provisions that were in the community centre in their local community, all the provisions were on the ground floor in the kitchens. So when people evacuated to the building and the inundation flooded the building, the provisions were lost in the tsunami. So there needs to be a dedicated resource for provisions stored on upper floors. It might sound obvious, Unfortunately, the community centre example shows that it wasn't happening in Japan. The potential for people to stay in the buildings for several days comes from the amount of debris that can block exits, stairwells and doors. And in many cases, the Japanese self-defense force and fire departments were required to dig out stairwells before people could exit the building. One of the buildings that did have provisions provided in it had provisions that, under the assumption that people would only be there for 6 hours. So unfortunately, that didn't go far enough to account for people being trapped in there. And as the slides before showed, this can be hundreds of people in a building. So on a case-by-case basis, we need to understand potential numbers of people going to these buildings. And there's also a consideration that having provisions in the buildings and the knowledge that people have provisions may encourage people to go to these buildings if they know they're going to have food and water and shelter there. And in the event of further events, the provision of food and water may encourage people to go back to those buildings. And there's some research done in following tropical cyclone events in India and Bangladesh that showed that people's knowledge that they would have food and water and shelter improves their response and reaction towards evacuation centres in subsequent events. So, leaving vertical evacuation buildings there, I'll go through some of the warnings and people's response to warnings and evacuation methods. So first off, the response to natural warnings. As the officials, the slide that showed the officials' comments earlier, it was well recognised that along the coast the shaking was over 2 minutes, up to over 3 minutes in some locations, and it was significant amounts of shaking. So the education, the natural warnings such as ground shaking would precede or can precede a tsunami, works well in many places, and some data that's come from surveys done by the NPO SEMI almost 90% of people in Kamaishi evacuated within 20 minutes, and the majority of those immediately. Of those people who evacuated immediately, 2/3 recognised that a tsunami could be coming, and the rest of those people evacuated on seeing other people run. So we see this cascading effect of people who are unsure of whether to evacuate, actually being triggered by people who have already decided to move. And this was seen in Natori, in the plains further down the coast as well, although the percentage of people who evacuated immediately was slightly lower. But a significant difference was that 50% of those who didn't evacuate immediately stayed for between 20 and 60 minutes. Now, the tsunami arrival here was around 60 minutes, but the key point is that the people here stayed to clean up debris from the earthquake, so debris in and around their houses or checking to see if families were okay after the earthquake. They didn't, or a large proportion of the population didn't recognise that a tsunami would affect their area. And they'd only had previous experiences 2 meters in recent experience. So many people didn't expect a tsunami to strike the residential area this time. It was really the young people who reacted immediately to the ground shaking. So it suggests some regional differences between the northern areas, which have had significant tsunamis in recent history, and further down the coast where the tsunami experience is maybe further back in history, or certainly of a smaller magnitude. And this, of course, is going to be a key impact in New Zealand and Washington, where we don't have the recent history of 10 metres of inundation in our populated places. But the education in New Zealand around natural and informal warnings is, in the case of a large earthquake, we find it hard to stand up in. when you see unusual signs or unusual noises from the ocean, or in the case of weak rolling earthquakes lasting a long time, that people should evacuate all the zones that are included in our evacuation maps. So, judging from this advice, if this event had occurred offshore New Zealand, the advice is there to recognise whether people understand this fully and to assess the potential response. And similarly, in Washington and the west coast of and Alaska Warning Center, the advice is immediate evacuation on feeling the earthquake. Bits of advice to say, if an earthquake occurs and you're in a coastal area, turn on the radio to find out if there's a warning. And that's part of the preparation on the page before tsunami. During tsunami, they then go on to say evacuate immediately, but only after the evacuation order, so the official warning. And perhaps that needs to be changed to be more consistent with the immediate evacuation after natural warnings from the state of Washington and the warning centre. So on to the formal warnings. So the JMA issued a warning 3 minutes after the ground shaking occurred, and the warning in Iwate and Miyagi was for a major tsunami, and they issue a major tsunami warning if the expected wave height ashore is over 3 meters, and they then specify the expected wave height, whether it be 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 or 10 meters at the coastline. For events, for expected wave heights between 1 and 3, they issue a tsunami warning, and if there's half a meter, I think to a meter, they issue an advisory. So in this case, they issued straight away a major tsunami warning and gave the 3 meters and the 6 meters, respectively, for Iwate and Miyagi. And they issue a height for every prefectural area along the coast. So the second warning they provided 25 minutes later upgraded this in Iwate to 6 meters and then to 10 meters in Miyagi, and then a further upgrade 15 minutes later to 10 meters in Iwate. And this warning stayed in effect for a couple of days before they began downgrading the warning until the warning was cancelled altogether. So this broadcast of JMA estimated wave height so soon after the tsunami had a couple of unfortunate effects. In Taro, some people warning of 3 meters wave height, and as they were behind a 10-meter wall, some people didn't evacuate. That didn't affect the huge percentage of the population who evacuated immediately. So there's evidence natural warning and the education around immediate evacuation did still work in that location. In Kamaishi, the local government continued to broadcast their warning across the speakers that are located in the street, citing 3 meters, even after the warning had been raised to 6 meters from the JMA. So somewhere along the line, that message didn't get through to the people on the ground in the town who needed the information. And in Cascadia, the upgrade came after the tsunami waves had already started arriving. So there's some consideration that needs to be taken around using estimated heights in such immediate warnings. In New Zealand, we have threat levels that work on a similar basis to the JMA warnings, based on tsunami height of the coast. But these are unlikely to be used in a local event, as we don't have the capability of producing a warning within the earthquake. So it's less of an issue in New Zealand for the for the local events where we encourage the natural warnings. And there's education around using these warnings that's required to ensure people don't treat these as absolute figures, and that it's really a guide and people should evacuate in any case. And the final point on this slide just refers to really the setup of the warning systems in Japan. Japanese towns and cities have networks of street speakers where the local government broadcasts information to the town regularly. So it's not just a system purely for tsunami sirens. So they want that system to be functioning after the event to provide welfare announcements to people, instructions on basic food or any other welfare issues. And in Ofanato, the tsunami inundation actually flooded the power packs on these towers. So their system was out of action for these welfare announcements post-event. In Minami Sanriku, the civil protection building has been shown on the media, and that was inundated above the roof. And so their broadcast point for these tsunami warnings and for welfare announcements was out of action, and it remains out of action. So they had a backup station further up the hillside, where they relocated their emergency management division. But the capacity of that facility to continue broadcasting wasn't sufficient for the continuing announcement of welfare. So that issue really raised the importance of having a backup facility with similar capacity to be able to produce or broadcast the required announcements and further warnings if required. For the movement of people during and after the evacuation, these are issues that have been reported in full tsunami recently. People driving into the low-lying areas, into the inundation zone or the hazard zone prior to wave arrival to collect family. People's expectation of accurate arrival times and having evacuated to a refuge uphill, people returning once they see that maybe 5 minutes after an arrival time the wave still hasn't arrived. So they consider the tsunami the warning to be a false warning. The impression that tsunami's passed. So as I said before, the arrival of troughs 60 minutes after the first waves on the Washington coast, that occurred in Ishinomaki, and people considered that the withdrawal of the water from the city signified the end of the event. People returned to low-lying events only for a fourth and a fifth wave to inundate the city. And there's the unnecessary collection of school children. In Taro particularly, there was a collection of school children where parents drove into and through the inundation zone before wave arrival to go and collect their children from a school that in the event wasn't inundated. So the children who stayed at the school were safe. The parents, in some cases, died on the way to the school, and in other cases, the parents had collected the children driving through the inundation zone as the wave arrived. So I'll come on to the situation in New Zealand. But talking to John just before the presentation, it sounds like Washington are moving towards a comprehensive schools evacuation for Washington, which is definitely the way we need to go. So we need to continue the education around the waiting at uphill for an all-clear message and not returning to low-lying areas after the first wave or when we see water receding. One of the big things to come out of this event is this philosophy of Tsunami Tendenko, and it's been in the media, and there's now a fantastic video on Al Jazeera website, which I've included a link on my final slide to, and I recommend people go and watch that video. And it talks through this philosophy of Tsunami Tendenko to evacuate immediately on feeling the ground shaking or other natural warnings, to treat self-evacuation as a priority and not stop to help other people, just for everybody to evacuate themselves, and for people to use their initiative in what is a dynamic event. So if you stop at an evacuation place and it looks like it might be inundated or the tsunami is too close, then evacuate further to a higher area or further inland. And this was shown to work very well in a couple of schools in Kamaishi City in village Tsunami, where 2 schools evacuated on the ground shaking before even waiting for teachers to give the order to evacuate. And the junior high school, I guess middle school age, the elementary school children all evacuated together up the hill to their primary evacuation site. And then on seeing the tsunami arriving, evacuated to a second and then a third evacuation site further up the hill. And everybody who was at school that day survived as a result of the education that they'd had for a couple of years previous with a professor from Gunma University. So the school response in New Zealand has been shown by in some recent work that unfortunately a lot of the coastal schools don't have tsunami drills and haven't practiced tsunami. So tsunami tendenka and the education of parents not going to schools to pick up their children and to rendezvous with the children and the staff at the evacuation site after the event, as is educated in Washington, really needs to be incorporated into New Zealand schools, and really, I think, got quite a way to go, especially in those coastal schools. So the use of vehicles in evacuation is constantly discussed in the response during tsunami, and Japan educated people to evacuate on foot. But we saw a really mixed response depending on the area. In Taro, most people who arrived at evacuation centres arrived on foot, so there seemed to be a very high awareness of the congestion issue. In Minami Sanriku, there was congestion in the first 10 minutes, but the officials told us there that the use of vehicles in evacuation was almost forbidden, and after 10 minutes there was no congestion, so it seemed to be a very small proportion of people who actually used vehicles in that location. In Ishinomaki, there's a different story, and there was significant congestion on the main roads inland, and actually in one of the April aftershocks, the same level of congestion occurred again as people tried to drive out of town. There's also congestion seen in Kamaishi and Kesonuma, and the fire department had to go out and tell people to abandon their cars and run up the hills. In Kamaishi, surveys from the non-profit organisation SEMI showed that 64% of people evacuated on foot. Now, when we spoke to the official, he said that he considered that the emphasis on evacuation on foot hadn't been portrayed enough or hadn't been emphasised enough to the public, and so he felt that that's something that they need to improve on. And it seemed that the congestion was very localised in Kamaishi to the main road that runs very close to the harbour. So this could be an issue in towns and within cities rather than as a whole population centre. And it may just be choke points, but there's an issue that's recognised already. So obviously it's a significant challenge when people want to evacuate their whole family or make sure that they evacuate far enough inland, or when they're evacuating people who can't walk, so disabled or the elderly. And this is where siting of vertical evacuation buildings can really help. If we site them cleverly near vulnerable populations, schools and care homes, then that can essentially help reduce this need and provide to use the vehicles. And again, this might come down to an issue of social responsibility and portraying the fact that use of vehicles congests the roads and prevents everybody from evacuating rather than everybody evacuating on foot and the collective can evacuate faster. And just a point on a scheme that we saw in Ryoishi, certain cars have been designated as vehicles that would go into the inundation zone and collect elderly and disabled people and evacuate them out. Unfortunately, in this event, the designated cars weren't in Ryoishi at the time of the tsunami, so weren't able to get into Rio Issue before the arrival of the wave. So the scheme didn't work in this instance. But there may be some benefit from labelling cars around educational awareness, and it's something that we'll think about further as we write the report up from this trip. And finally, on hazard and evacuation maps, again, the data from SEMI suggests that people who have had hazard maps delivered to their homes, over 70% haven't actually looked at the hazard map. And these hazard maps are delivered in Japan as part of sort of phone directories or local service guides. So it suggests that just having the paper maps delivered to people's homes doesn't work solely. I've just included a couple of examples of an information board that's put up in parks in some areas of New Zealand. And on the right-hand side is a photo of a blue line painted on the road. And this is a pilot project in Wellington where the community were asked what they wanted to include on evacuation maps, the route that they wanted, whether they wanted the town hall or police station. Including two lines of the road at the maximum extent of the tsunami evacuation zone. So on every road that crosses the evacuation zone in this pilot area, there's a blue line on the road. And the lady in the photos from Samoa Emergency Management, and I think this is something that they've taken on as well in Samoa. So also around the hazard maps, the Yamaguchi University have done some work around fatality rates by neighbourhood, and that work's indicated increased fatality rates around the edge of the hazard zones. Now in this event, the hazard zones were underestimated due to the source event that was used, but it also might suggest that people living immediately outside the hazard zone consider that line without considering the uncertainty around it. These people apparently waited until the tsunami reached their neighbourhood before evacuating, whereas the people well within the hazard zone and the evacuation area were more likely to evacuate on feeling the ground shaking. It raises some issues around the awareness of the hazard locally from these publications. So to summarise all of that, it's encouraging that both US and New Zealand are moving in the right direction and have been carrying out education that's been shown to work well in Japan in this event. But there are issues that show we need to continue to understand people's likely response and the level of understanding of the education that we're giving, that we're providing. There's a few potential solutions to issues around 24-hour access to buildings, to congestion, to dealing with the owner agreement issue that we're talking about with evacuation buildings. And we've got plenty of evidence now and coming out of Japan over the next few months of these issues that we've talked about, but maybe haven't had solid numbers and proof that these issues have a big impact and have been able to assess them relatively. So this work's coming out of this event and out of Japan as we speak. And for me, the two biggest things we need to take on board are this philosophy of tsunami tendenko, and of course it's culturally sensitive, and you might be asking people to leave loved ones in the evacuation zone as you leave. So there's more consideration of how that could be adopted in other locations outside of Japan, and particularly for New Zealand, this issue of schools and parents driving to schools where the schools might be safe, or the children might be safe already through their previous evacuation planning. So I'll just leave a slide up with several links. As I mentioned before, the Al Jazeera film is well worth watching. it deals with the example of those two schools and the use of the Tendenko philosophy in the wider community in Kamaishi. And there's links to the Project Safe Haven and the Geohazards International projects in Washington and Sumatra, respectively, and a couple of links to the JTDR website in New Zealand, just to highlight the work that we're doing, tsunami and volcanic and earthquake risk. And finally, there'll be a GNS science report on this work coming out in the next few months, and we plan to write a paper on this work following this as well. Thank you very much.
We're going to go ahead and switch gears real briefly and talk about some of the work that's going on in Washington for the Safe Haven project, and then we're going to go ahead and open this up for all of your questions. First, I do want to thank Stuart Fraser for the outstanding presentation. I think there's a lot of just incredibly valuable information that's been gathered from his research, the research of other colleagues at GNS Science, and the variety of teams that have been there to bring back these really critical lessons for coastal communities in the United States. So real briefly, I'm going to talk about the Project Safe Haven, which is an effort that has been funded through the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program, and want to acknowledge the support that we've received from NOAA, that program, to help begin looking at a comprehensive effort to assess the vulnerability of communities in Washington and work directly with residents and a variety of stakeholders to identify potential evacuation sites and various strategies that really are driven by the community. Stuart did a great job of talking about the sources and some of the similarities between areas within Japan and areas within Washington. For those unfamiliar with our situation, like New Zealand, like Japan, and elsewhere in places like Puerto Rico, Alaska, Chile, we have a major subduction zone off of our coast, the Cascadia subduction zone. You see on that graphic by that little hash line. Looking at the modeling that's been done previously, we're anticipating a wave arrival of, depending upon your location, 30 to 40 minutes. Stuart had an excellent graphic demonstrating the topography that is very similar here and in many communities in the U.S. and on the West Coast in particular, with this flat topography coupled by these long peninsulas, in many cases with one road in and one road out. The majority of coastal communities, as we saw from the Japan event and previous events elsewhere, especially on the Washington coast, most of our outer coastal communities, areas along the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the north, are likely to be flooded from these types of events. And thinking about some of the vulnerable populations that we have, I think there's a lot of very important information that we can incorporate into our planning efforts like Safe Haven, specifically based on the Japan research to deal with these vulnerable segments of our population, seniors, children, disabled groups. And something that is not unique to us, but this untrained tourist population, but in our case it reaches more than 100,000 during peak summer months. So, why now? There's a lot of efforts, not only in Washington, but in other areas of the United States to look at tsunami vertical evacuation. But in our case, we do have this ticking time bomb off of our shore called the Cascadia subduction zone. And, various research has been done, a variety of research has been done, in which there's recurrence interval. We're entering or approaching a phase where we could be facing one of these events anytime very soon, although, of course, you never know, given the geologic time scale, whether it's tomorrow or whether it's going to be 50 years from now. But we need to start working and laying the groundwork for solid implementation of these types of evacuation strategies that have not existed in this country. And this demonstrates our current situation. We can spend as much time and effort doing outreach in very, very vulnerable communities, but the fact of the matter is there's just no place to go. We train people, and Stuart pointed out in some of his research, to follow those natural warning signs. When you feel the ground shake, move to high ground or inland immediately. We teach people to follow various types of evacuation routes, whether it's walking evacuation, running to high ground on foot during local earthquakes, during distant events, using the demarcated driving routes to get to safety. But in many cases, you just can't get there from here. It just doesn't matter to a large part because there's just no way to get people to safety given the limitations of topography and the geologic setting. So some research has previously been done by GNS Science and some funded by NSF grant, looking at how people perceive the risk and the threat. And to some part, especially in areas like Long Beach, which is shown here, and Ocean Shores, you see people who do not have trust in the evacuation brochures. And there's a reason why. They get it. They know that there's some limitations to the amount of time they have and the distance they can cover given the situation. But we can do better, and we will do better. Based on the research that's been done also previously, looking at how structures fared during past events, we finally have some official guidance that can be used not only to develop engineering standards that can be incorporated into building codes and will be included in the upcoming edition of the IBC as an appendix, I understand, but also some planning level guidance that community officials can use to start to integrate this type of new thinking into our evacuation planning. Additionally, we've been collaborating with Nate Wood from the USGS, and some of his work has examined how fast people can actually move given a variety of circumstances, looking at land conditions, the types of grounds that they have to cover, whether it's sandy beaches, paved roadways, marshy swamps, dense forests, whatever the case may be, where population is located, and how quickly they can get to safety. As you can see from this graphic, again using the Long Beach Peninsula as an example, it's not unique. There are other areas like this throughout the Washington coast, the Tokeland Peninsula, Ocean Shores, Westport, and on it goes, where you have these areas, and this graph shows travel time to safety. If we're planning on, even a best case scenario, 30 to 40 minutes, anything that shows up as orange, red, pink, you can run a 7-minute mile, but you're not going to get out. That's just the fact of the matter. And this is a great indication of areas that we can use and information we can use to integrate into our planning efforts to show high priority areas where these types of structures are absolutely going to be critical to get people to safety. Thinking in terms of our risk, just to capture real briefly, what's at stake? And what are we talking about here when we're talking about the need to integrate this type of evacuation strategy into communities? Well, in Washington, we've got a little over 40,000 people that live and work in hazard zones on a daily basis. Given the population makeup, most of these people are retirees. They don't move very quickly in a lot of cases. We've got almost 25,000 people that work in these zones every day, and as I mentioned previously, the 100,000 plus number of tourists that come to visit the beautiful coastline of Washington and the Pacific Northwest during the wonderful summer months that we have. We have a lot of visitors to state parks and people who aren't familiar with a lot of the education aspects in terms of evacuation upon feeling the ground shake from these types of local earthquakes and tsunamis. So there's some other populations that need to be considered. People who just come for the day, these untrained tourists, people who are dependent, people who are in schools, children who are in daycares, people who are in jails in a lot of cases. 33% of our coastal workforce is in an area that's going to be impacted by this type of an event. And there's a wide variety of businesses, but also a lot of critical facilities and responders that are going to be not available necessarily to get people to safety. They're going to be need to look out for themselves as well. So, given some of the parameters and the publication of this new advice and guidance jointly authored by FEMA and NOAA, Federal Emergency Management Agency and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, coupled with an influx of short-term funding from the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program, we've been collaborating with the University of Washington and others on Project Safe Haven. And this is a community-based, what we call top-down planning approach. And when I say top-down, we put the community at the top. They're in the driver's seat. We bring in the relevant experts to help them facilitate and navigate this process of how these types of structures can be integrated into the community, but this needs to be their plan. Again, given the fact that we don't know when these events are going to occur, the structures need to be also multi-purpose, and that's been our mantra throughout this effort. Multi-purpose, 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 because that way they're more useful, they provide a lot more utility on a daily basis, and people become familiar with them, as we saw from some of Stuart's examples in Japan, schools, hospitals, other buildings that people know about, use, have familiarity with, so when the time came, they could get there and knew what to do. It's heartening to hear some of the themes that Stuart presented, and thinking about what we're hearing from coastal residents. What we ask, and I'll talk a little bit about the planning process in a second, but what we ask people to do is prioritize. Given limited funding or no funding at this point, what are the priorities going to be? And it's heartening to see that overwhelmingly people say, well, we've got to put something by the schools. Kids are our priority. They're the future. They represent the greatness of our community, and we've got to do something to protect them, because in many cases the schools have no places to evacuate to. Seniors and special needs populations, trying to integrate something very close to those areas so that people, again, with limited mobility have the availability of high ground nearby. Looking at some of the travel times, what you see on that graphic there are some circles, and those represent how far people can walk in 15 minutes. Given a variety of travel times, the community members themselves overwhelmingly said we need to be more conservative with the estimates that we're using. Yeah, your modeling is great, and it says we may have 30 to 40 minutes, but let's be real, let's be practical, let's think about some of the challenges we may face given an evacuation, debris within roadways, trying to just compose yourself after this pretty intensive ground chasing. They wanted to be much more conservative. So we, of course, accommodated their willingness to try and use these types of smaller travel times that people walk to facilities. When I say all of the options in the previous slide were on the table, this is what we were considering. Each one has their pros and cons. We're talking about towers, buildings, and berms. There's again pros and cons, benefits and trade-offs, depending upon the type of facility that is integrated within the community. But we left these decisions up to the community members themselves. They know their community better than we do. We trust their judgment, and of course they're going to need to live and work and play with these types of structures on a more frequent basis. So it's got to be something that they have buy-in to from the very beginning. Towers, very small. They can contain smaller numbers of evacuees. Buildings that can accommodate more people, but they're more expensive. And as we begin to get into how high something needs to be, well, we better get it right the first time, or have some pretty substantial factors of safety built into that, because if we build it too tall, maybe we're leaving some resources on the table that could be directed elsewhere. But if we build it too short, well, I think we've seen from Japan some of the challenges that poses. Trying to find ways to incentivize and encourage this type of evacuation strategy with private development or possibly public development. Berms are, depending upon the community, something that many are very interested in. People love the Washington coast. They love the open feel of it, the outdoors, the natural setting. Trying to integrate these types of natural features into the community is something that especially people in Pacific County and Southwest Washington were primarily interested in. I want to talk very briefly about the process that we used to gather this input. Again, everything is being driven by community members to help set the stage for how this can integrate into existing and future planning. I'll talk a little bit about some of these in detail in a second, but what we do is we meet first with the local emergency manager, get their input, feedback, and some direction from them. We start with what we call a World Cafe or Conversation Cafe, and we talk candidly about some of the challenges that we're facing. Again, looking back at previous research, people may not have a high degree of trust in some of the evacuation brochures because they understand the limitations. So they come to the table willing to talk and want to contribute to trying to make their community safer. We collect this information through a meeting where people work in small groups, looking at various options, the berms, buildings, or towers, or in some cases a hybrid approach. The project team takes that information back and provides 4 or 5 different alternatives back to the community. And it's sort of integrating all of the feedback that we've heard from the first meeting. From that, the community members themselves are facilitated through a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis for each of the alternatives. And at the conclusion of that meeting, which takes place about a month or so after the first meeting, you can start to see a development of a preferred alternative, a consensus approach to what's going to be the best strategy given local needs. But that's step one. We bring in architects and urban designers to help translate what these might look like. And then finally, again, we ask them to rank how and where the priorities are. So the first step in this process is to figure out where people want these. So just talk real briefly, and using Long Beach as an example again throughout this to be consistent. This work has been done for Grays Harbor County, and we're in the process of wrapping it up for Clallam County and the tribes in that vicinity. But you can see the strategies that have been identified from the community participation, looking at an interest in this case in berms. One of the things that we heard time and again was we need to plan for a large number of tourists, but maybe not peak tourist season. We got to, this could be a starting point. We can try and integrate those over time, but let's plan for the full-time residents as well as an average summer day. So maybe not that peak day, but more of an average. Looking in more north on the Long Beach Peninsula, the primary focus was on walking routes. There is some natural high ground in those areas, trying to capitalize on the education piece there to let people know where they are, how to get there. But in some cases near the school and other areas, that may be an opportunity again for implementing vertical evacuation as an evacuation approach. On the southern end of the peninsula, for example, there's a really abundant high ground in areas like Waco, Washington, but some subdivisions, like the Vandalia subdivision, some of the campgrounds within the state parks, have low elevation, and something needs to be considered there as an evacuation approach. The Tokeland North Cove, Washington area, this is also home to the Shoalwater Bay tribe, and so we're working very closely and had a session of outreach and got feedback directly from them on how we can work to try to incorporate vertical evacuation into some of the existing recreational uses. Birding is very, very popular on the Tokeland Peninsula, so trying to capitalize on some revenue generation, trying to leverage that as a tourist opportunity, and as well as the casino and other facilities that do draw in larger numbers of people to accommodate some of the greater density within those areas, possibly through an elevated parking structure. So once we've got an idea from the community about where they want these things, again, we've got to think about the capacity. I would wouldn't pay too much attention necessarily to the minimum structure height. Those will vary. People did try to capitalize on the existing high ground where it was available. So they didn't have to invest more resources into trying to build something taller. But in a lot of cases, that's just not feasible. So there are some of those things that need to be considered. Looking at a capacity analysis of, again, full-time population within a given vicinity, trying to accommodate for a dispersed group of tourists that are located in a variety of areas of coastal communities. So that's step one. Step two is, what do people want these things to look like? You can see on the very basic tower something that could be used very simple, maybe the Kia model to vertical evacuation as opposed to something much, much more elaborate. And this is a library meeting facility in Japan that is designated as a vertical evacuation. This may be more along the lines of your Lexus model, but we wanted to make sure that we were trying to span the range of interests and desires from community participants. I'll talk through some of the designs. So these are some of the graphics that have come up in terms of berms. The graphic on your left, you see sort of a red square. That's Long Beach Elementary School. There was a berm identified as a strategic option there, something that can incorporate it into a play facility. There's various baseball and softball fields around there, so they can serve as a bleacher for people to come and watch baseball games, softball games, but also have some utility in the meantime. I should mention that these are all conceptual level designs. We do not have full engineering for this. That's something that went based on the results of this effort. Maybe a few demonstration projects or implementation will come out of this. But thinking again about these berms, this kind of gives some context to what it could look like, what it would be, and how it could integrate in terms of recreational and play opportunities for a variety of visitors and residents within the community. Looking and trying to tie these into park systems and trails, how these vertical evacuation berms can, here you see ones with little pavilions on top, as well as a pedestrian crossing for something called the Tinker Trail that's being investigated and developed throughout the Long Beach Peninsula. Moving on to building, that was a lot of the research and findings that came from Stuart's work in Japan. Be interested to hear some of the costs associated with this type of construction. There's some information from the FEMA guidance on looking at a 7 to 10% increase in cost. One of the ways that our architects and, again, working with the community members have identified that maybe a lower cost alternative to constructing an entire building to these standards is doing an addition. So something that could be a stairwell or stair core that's an addition to the building. The building itself is sacrificial and can wash away because it may not be built to current code. We don't have very many tall structures in many of our coastal communities. But something like this might be a nice addition at a much lower cost to, again, provide some safety and easily disperse these throughout the community. Towers, again, looking at a variety of uses, fire hose training tower, drying towers, training facilities, visitor centers, trying to capitalize on drawing people to the coast by providing some area of safe refuge. So this could be, for an example, a visitor center. It could be located anywhere. This is more of a typology than a specific design for a single location. Looking at the Tokeland Peninsula, there was an emphasis on towers in that area, and this kind of shows that community flavor to what they're trying to incorporate, what they would expect it to look like within the area that people could use to watch birds and have a variety of other uses, whale watching, for example. Trying to integrate these into other components of future land use and redevelopment plans. So, for example, the port of Tokeland, looking at a market square, farmers market concept to draw people in. And again, if they're there, something happens, there would be an area of refuge. You see that demarcated by this red tower that could be integrated within the community. So step one, figuring out where they want to go. Step two, figuring out what the community members see and envision these types of vertical evacuation refuges looking like.
And then, of course, the final component, or one of the final components, is trying to figure out what the cost is. We have preliminary engineering for a variety of locations that have been identified from both Pacific County, Grays Harbor County, and soon to be Clallam County. As you can see, this doesn't include land cost. We try to capitalize, or community members themselves try to capitalize on publicly owned land where it was available, but in some cases there may need to be some acquisition that would be done through payment of fair market value. There was a real concern for most of the community members that eminent domain not be used to take property. They try and locate things in areas where people were willing to work with the community members and not necessarily go about it in a more adverse or adversarial way. The cost, when we start to think about it, looking at the numbers that come out of cost-benefit analyses from FEMA and others, if you start to examine what those boil down to in terms of a particular individual, it's impossible because human life is, of course, priceless. But there has to be some method to derive whether or not these are a wise investment of dollars. Looking at the numbers of lives that have been saved in Japan, that could be saved on our coast as well as elsewhere throughout the U.S. FEMA figures we're all worth about $5 million. We're talking about things that are substantially less than that to save large numbers of people. For some areas, we do have much more detailed cost estimates. This was a specific study commissioned working with Degenkolb engineers to try and identify design-level costs for actually integrating or building something like this. So once you start to accommodate a variety of costs into this, and you can start to see what it looks like. The final step in this is developing a community-based plan. Something that everyone has pride and ownership. They've been a stakeholder, they're engaged, and really it represents the wills and desires of the community over a long period of time. These plans aren't developed overnight. Each community, each county is about a year's worth of effort, investment of time, and engagement. And we're really thankful for the people within those jurisdictions that have volunteered to spend a lot of their time helping shape how they want to make their community safer. Going back to how do we know it's going to work? Well, I think we've seen from Stuart in Japan that it does work. And based on some modeling that's been done first by Dr. Harry Ye, looking at a variety of case studies. This is sort of the first generation of this, how these types of facilities could reduce losses of life on the Washington coast. Looking at a variety of warning transmission, evacuation locations, the population, the road network, and that's what this model assumes as opposed to the work that was done by Dr. Nate Wood, which was much more pedestrian-oriented over a variety of land types. This is primarily using the road network. And once we put all that together and a model of tsunami coming in, we can start to see, given nothing, what the total losses might be. And then as we begin to integrate vertical evacuation options, we can see those numbers decline. And this is only 3 locations identified within this preliminary work. In theory, I think we like to think we can get this number to 0, but again, we know there's unfortunately always going to be the people who don't evacuate, people who go to watch the tsunami. As much education as we can do to prevent that, we do. But I think it goes to show that this is a viable strategy for safety in coastal communities. So where are we going from here with Project Safe Haven? Then we're going to wrap up the Clallam County jurisdictions, the Makah tribe, the Quiu tribes, mid-2012. There'll be final presentations to county and tribal officials. We are in the process of working with the NOAA Pacific Marine Environmental Lab to have additional modeling done. And that's why I said please don't pay too much attention to some of those heights because those are likely to change given the new LIDAR elevation data that FEMA acquired for the coast. That's being incorporated into these newer models. and at a much more finer scale, so we can have better information for site-specific elevations. Continuing to work and try and find support for funding. I think anybody that's been involved with this knows right now that in anything, funding is a challenge, but looking at ways to make smart investments this is a good way to go, especially when you compare this to other funded mitigation strategies like tornado safe rooms. Tornado could go a variety of places, but we know tsunamis being hit our coast, and we know we've got vulnerable people that don't have any place to evacuate to. We know we can do something about it now, and we're going to continue to push that. We've tried to incorporate social media and use emerging technologies like Facebook and other aspects like Twitter to help disseminate the work that we're doing, collect feedback, get support, and answer questions, and have folks contribute through things like Facebook. So like us on Facebook. Feel free to visit the page, check us out, see what's going on, share your thoughts. We want to know so with that, I want to conclude my presentation, and at this time, just go ahead and open it up for questions from people who are here or who are on the phone.
I had a question for Peter. Given you had a lot of information about how people got warning and information, and did you see a large use of social media? Yeah. Big word of evacuation. Oh my God.
There's a lot of evidence of people further down the coast where cell networks weren't affected by the ground shaking. For example, people in Tokyo were seeing footage live on mobile phones. In Nakuru City, even though they had 60 minutes wave arrived, the earthquake shaking had damaged communication networks, so there weren't phones or TV or radio, so the people in Nakuru apparently weren't getting information from further up the coast, which may have saved them if those systems were working. In terms of social media, I'm not sure. Presumably, if the cell phones are down and the internet's down, then it's lacking. Which is, the communication networks being down just illustrates the importance of people reacting to the warnings that they experience personally and see around them.
There's a question from Bob Freitag. It says it seems that debris was an issue in structural integrity. Can you comment on the following three approaches? They're up there as well. Increasing structural strength and transparencies, breakaway walls like the first floors, and the use of buffers, and they worked, what kinds, if they worked and what kinds worked.
We didn't see any buildings designed with specific breakaway walls. The glazing and doorways of buildings were often removed, and that allowed some free flow of the tsunami. In terms of buffers, there was a photo that I showed of an apartment block that had a steel structure on the front, and that was a vertical car park that you drive the car in, and the cars go on a rotating rack, and that was a vertical tower for those. And there was some debris damage to that steel structure, which presumably saved the main reinforced concrete structure from severe damage, but those specific shields weren't observed on many buildings. In terms of structural strength, all the buildings we saw seemed to be, the majority were reinforced concrete shear wall. That's the typical school and apartment block construction.
He also asked, can you summarize the effectiveness of towers, buildings, and berms?
We didn't see any specific towers in those areas. All of the examples that I showed were buildings, and that's pretty typical of what we saw. There was a raised park in Sendai Port that was effective, I think, for saving a few people, but that hadn't been designated as a vertical evacuation structure because the raised park had been constructed from fill that had been dredged from the port. So there was a feeling that it may not survive the earthquake. But it had been designed with gentle sloping stairs and a ramp up to a sheltered area. And I think it did save some people. The other feature in Japan is small hills that shrines are put on. And the photos that I showed from Uriagi were taken from a very small hill that was overtopped. I think it was about up to 5 meters in height with a sort of shrine on top of that. But that didn't prove effective in the event. But yeah, the majority of buildings that we saw were majority of facilities that we saw were buildings.
That's it for an online question.
Okay.
Somebody have a question?
Sounds very good.
One of the things we did, we recorded this presentation. We will post it on our website, which is www.emd.wa.gov, as well as try and distribute the link and information to some of our other partners, including CREW, the Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group, www.crew.org. And you can always email me, and I can try and make sure we send you the information. And my email address is j.schelling, SCHELLING, @emd.wa.gov. I'd like to thank all of the participants. I'd like to thank Stuart Fraser for sharing this information with us. I think there's a lot of positives that have come out of the research. It's looking like we're really on the right track in a lot of cases. Maybe a few variations in other things that maybe had not been considered initially but need to be revisited or incorporated into some of the approaches. But overall, it seems like we're really marching down a good path to try and make coastal communities in Washington and the United States safer. So with that, I want to go ahead and wrap this up. And thank you all for your time.